Hi, everyone. This is going to be a research talk, and I'd like to start it out with a little thought experiment. So I want you to close your eyes, even the ones who are on their phones right now. Close your eyes and try to think of one issue, either a social or a political or an environmental issue, that you disagree with. And now think of what it would take for you to change your mind. Now open your eyes again. My first hypothesis is that you thought of long, exhaustive arguments and conversations, perhaps of engaging with a community that holds this different viewpoint and getting to know them better, or perhaps even a life-changing moment that shakes you at your core and that really makes you question and rethink your values and your beliefs. My second hypothesis is that not many of you thought of strapping on a virtual reality headset, watching a storyline that aligns with the opposing view, then taking it off and running around, immediately signing petitions and volunteering for the cause. And my third hypothesis is that you're most likely right. This question, whether virtual reality can be used for good, for overall pro-social and social change, is a question that I've been looking at for the past 8 years in my research career. Because I'm a media scholar, so suddenly having a media device, a media technology in your hands that can actually transport people into the heart of an event, that can transform you into one of the characters and actors within this event, or even show you the world through somebody else's eyes, is an incredible challenge. So for the past 8 years, I've been actually looking at VR for good, and specifically whether it is any good. Now, as a social scientist or communication scientist in my case, what you can do is you can either run an experiment where you bring people into the lab, you have two different groups. One sees a storyline in the virtual reality headset, the other group perhaps on a different device, and then you compare the attitudinal effect that was induced and try to sort of find a causality there. What you can also do to reach more conclusive answers is you can take all of the literature and all of the research studies that have been done on this particular issue, put them together, ran an overall analysis, and see whether they actually found a similar thing. And that's exactly what I did. Now, me and my colleagues, we ran a meta-analysis with a systematic review of all of the relevant VR for good literature that is out there. I want to be right honest, right up front. A meta-analysis comes with many benefits and with many limitations, like any other social science method, actually. The big benefit is that it actually can help you reach conclusive answers better and more than, for instance, just running a single experiment. Another big benefit is that it actually can uncover bigger trends and patterns within the research that are spanning across different research studies, different research labs, and even different time zones. However, a weakness of a meta-analysis is that it's just as good as the studies that you include. And furthermore, sometimes you just don't include the important studies because they haven't been published, maybe because they didn't find an effect and never actually published in a journal. So whatever I share with you today, please think critically of and take with a grain of salt. Still, me and my colleagues, we thought that a meta-analysis might be a great tool to better understand VR for good as a concept. And so we proceeded with our data collection. Now, a meta-analysis is quite complex, but I'm going to break it down. What you first need to do is you need to enter what I call the sea of studies. The sea of studies is basically the place where all of the more or less relevant experimental research that we were looking at was out there, different data libraries, research journals, etc. But still, it's a huge, huge sea. So you really need to make sure that you include studies that actually fit your research question. And for that, we use what I used to call the researcher's net. The researcher's net is basically all of your systematic and thorough and transparent criteria that will help you include and only include studies that work for your research question, thus making sure that you're not mixing up apples with oranges. So we ran the fishing net again and again and again, eventually reaching a pool of 39 studies that included 50 different experiments, because sometimes a research study can have different experiments in one. And after analyzing those 39 studies and those 50, almost 30 years of research, we took away 3 main lessons that I want to share with you today. Lesson number 1. Whenever the influence of virtual reality on an attitude on social or political or environmental issues was compared to the influence of a less immersive treatment, think of a flyer, a video, even your own imagination, the effect was consistently and significantly larger than the counter condition. So for example, if you bring people into the lab and one group is randomly assigned to a VR headset and they see a story about the importance of protecting the rainforest, and the other group just reads about it on a flyer, then the group with a VR experience is more likely to think positive of protecting the forest after the experience than the other group. Now, I cannot tell you why this happened. This can be presence, or telepresence, or social presence, or co-presence, or self-presence, or all of the other types of presence that are out there. But it's an interesting trend that we saw span across all of the studies that we looked at. The second, more surprising lesson was that embodiment did not enhance this effect. Meaning that regardless whether you visited the rainforest in a low-key 360 VR experience, or in a fully embodied, full agency, interactive, computationally, artificially created VR environment, the effect was still larger than the one of the counter treatment, of the less immersive treatment, and it actually didn't become larger. Even though in the literature there's actually robust evidence that embodiment in general should enhance the effect. And the third lesson regards specifically perspective taking. And what we found is that across most of the perspective-taking studies in VR for Good, whenever somebody took the perspective and the visual viewpoint of an outgroup member, so for instance, when a male VR user took the perspective of a female avatar in VR, then afterwards they were more likely to have their bias towards this group, so in that case gender bias, reduced in comparison to the male user who remained in the male VR perspective. So these 3 lessons, the importance of immersive modality, maybe the less importance of embodiment, and the role of perspective taking, are quite interesting and are fascinating and are actually opening up so many new research questions. But they don't really and directly answer the question whether VR for Good is any good. And the reason for that is that they need to be read in the context of the limitations and challenges that we actually found in the literature. First, we found treatment differences. So there were a couple of studies where, for instance, a 15-minute VR video was compared to a text. But reading a text is very subjective in terms of the duration. Some of you might read a text in 3 minutes, some of you might take 13 minutes, which means that what you compare differs in more than 2 things, in more than one thing. It differs in the immersive modality, but also the duration. So it's really hard to actually draw a causal line between one thing and the other. The second thing that we unfortunately found is backfiring effects, specifically when it comes to perspective-taking studies. And what I mean by that is that whenever a user took and adapted the perspective of an outgroup member, like I told you beforehand, and the social situation of the perspective-taking was negative and uncomfortable, then there was a likelihood of the bias actually being increased rather than decreased, which is super interesting because it basically means that perspective-taking can actually go both ways. People might take off the headset and go, oh wow, I can't believe what this group is going through, but they also can take off the headset and go, thank God I'm not part of this group. What we also saw, or what I think is a big question mark in the literature, is novelty effects. Now what I mean by that is that most of the subjects, or most of the people over the past, let's say 10 years, or 20 years, are not really used to virtual reality media experiences, which means that many of those studies brought people into the lab that had never used VR before, and they compared a media experience that's completely new to people with a media experience that people are having every day. And we don't know whether this plays any role, but my take is that it does interfere with the found effects within the literature. Another big question mark is sampling bias. And what I mean by that is that whenever you bring people into the lab and you want to see whether their social or political or environmental attitudes are changing, you want to make sure that you don't influence them beforehand. So you try to not really ask them about their views directly beforehand, otherwise it might distort the found effect and the outcome. But what this means is that we don't really know, in many of these studies, what the subjects were thinking politically. And some of the studies that controlled for political views before all of these experiments found that many of those samples were more or less on the progressive side of the political spectrum, which to me raises the question whether people who are signing up for a research study about virtual reality might in general be more open to new experiences and in turn also more open to politically new views. So what does this mean? It might mean, and this is like just a guess, that in some of those studies we've been taking progressive participants and showing them a progressive message with a progressive new medium and then finding progressive effects. Again, this is a question mark, but this needs to be figured out before we call VR an attitude change machine. And finally, short-term effects. Even if those effects are found, are like solid and legit, they are still short-term because we don't know how long they last. An attitudinal change about the environment or racial bias after such a study might last up to 5 or 10 months, or it might last up to an hour after taking off the headset. And we simply don't know because most of the studies don't even track that. So my personal take is that as long as we don't figure out how to solve all of these challenges and how to answer all of these question marks, we cannot speak of VR as an attitude change machine. At least, not now. And this is only my personal take here, but this might actually be a good thing. Because think of an attitude and what an attitude actually is. Attitudes are very complex constructs. They basically consist out of every unconscious and conscious decision you've ever made, of events that maybe happened to you or to friends, or to people in movies, and movies that you'll never remember. It's all of those invisible and visible moments that you pass through in your life. And this incredibly complex construct is supposed to be changed after one exposure with any media technology. I think this speaks perhaps a little bit less to what VR can do and more about what we think about ourselves that we cannot do. So I believe that the future of VR for good is perhaps taking 3 steps back and actually abandoning this hyperbolic and oversimplified way of looking at virtual reality. VR, at least for now, is not an attitude change machine. It's just a media technology with certain features that other media technologies do not have, like the radio, for instance, does not have visual modality that TV has, for instance. But this does not make TV a machine that can have a one-size-fits-all effect on how we think about ourselves and the world that we live in. So what I want to leave you with today is that if you're a policymaker, don't view virtual reality as this magical, completely new device that needs to have theories and policies that completely reinvent the wheel, but rather think of previous technologies and the learnings and the mistakes that we can sort of extrapolate and apply to VR. If you're a business leader or a designer who wants to use VR for powerful storytelling, then be aware that it's not going to work on everybody, and that you should design those experiences to not backfire on users. So I want to leave you with 2 things, a message and a question, and I'm going to go with the question first. If VR is really an attitude change machine, it should also work in the opposite way. It should also work on everybody who thinks of a progressive, who thinks progressively, to go into the more conservative direction after exposure. So I want you to critically take this question to you back home, and perhaps this makes you rethink about the capacity of the technology itself. And finally, I think what would benefit the field and the research and the industry is to work on VR and to embrace VR as what it is, and not as what we want it to be. Thank you. Sorry? Yeah. If you want to work or have a chat or coffee, it will be great to do so afterwards. Any questions? Yes, please.
Two questions. One is that comparing VR to text is also like comparing apples to oranges. Have you looked at comparing VR to probably film as the next sort of closest traditional media? And the other question is, I've never considered VR as an attitude change, but an awareness change. And have you looked at that? Because I think I see my artwork in general as, not as a way of I'm going to change, an apple to an orange, but I'm going to make the apple more aware of things that might be of importance to apples.
It's a great question. So regarding the first question, whether we saw differences between VR and video and VR and text, as far as I understood correctly, no, we didn't. We didn't specifically look at those differences as well, I have to be honest. So we sort of lumped together the effects of VR and then the effects of all of the counter treatments. So perhaps the next step in the research, in mine or in others, would be to again look specifically into those detailed differences between the different media. Because yeah, I give you, you're absolutely right, comparing even text with VR differs again on so many different modalities that it's hard to trace a causal link. And may I ask you to repeat your second question?
Yeah, you talked about people wanting to change attitudes. And changing an attitude is, of course, much more difficult than raising awareness of issues that people might be interested in the first place. And that's more what I see is possible in VR or in any other art form.
So the question is whether we also looked at the category of awareness next to the category of attitudinal change. We didn't. I'm not also aware of many studies that do, to be very honest with you. I think there's a big trend in the VR communication science literature that specifically looks either at attitudinal change, which we did, and empathy, which other scholars have done, but I'm not sure there's many studies on awareness. Again, how do you define awareness? Does that mean that you think faster of a mental object? Does it mean that you associate it with certain things? I don't know, but it's an interesting angle.
I think you could, an aspect of empathy would be an awareness, or so to speak, if you have a tendency to have empathy towards this question, but it's not really important to you. For instance, as this guy Richard with the innovation rules talked about, his wife said that, well, I've been telling you of all these problems that women have, versus men in society, and it's only now that you have a baby daughter that you actually are, so to speak, consciously aware of it, as opposed to, essentially having empathy for the subject but not acting on it.
To be very honest, I'm quite a bit of critical when it comes to all those empathy studies. Because, I mean, honestly, if you need to have a VR training for your colleagues, where male colleagues become a woman in VR for 3 minutes, so as not to be gender biased, then maybe the problem is not the VR, but the problem might be somewhere else. So I think empathy is a completely different kind of topic, but I'm happy to perhaps sit down afterwards and have a chat.